Hello, everybody. A few days ago, I did a show with Dan Brooks, excellent writer, has a new piece out in the New York Times on how generative AI complements the MAGA style. It's a kind of post-ironic treatment of irony, and he focuses on the Trump video of Gaza on Instagram. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was talking to Dan was whether we, or my generation at least, has got the MAGA movement, or at least the MAGA aesthetic, all wrong, and that they're the smart ones, they're the rebellious ones, and that I'm part of an old establishment that is no longer relevant. So I found someone who's part of my generation, William, or Bill, otherwise known, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Bill, because you put me under pressure. How do you pronounce your last name?
Deresiewicz.
Deresiewicz. I've had him on the show many times before, and I always screw up his name. It's a long Jewish Polish name.
That's right.
Not that I'm against Jews or Poles, Bill. You're the author. Your latest essays are The End of Solitude. You're also the author of Excellent Sheep, one of the most prescient, I think, of cultural observations about America's young. So I thought you'd be a good person, given that you're of a similar age demographic to myself, to imagine, Bill, whether we've got it all wrong, whether we're in the old generation and that the people putting together, I'm not sure if you've seen this sort of post-ironic, ironic 2025 Trump Gaza video, we're the ones who are now becoming old-fashioned.
Look, I think, first of all, one of the dire facts about getting old, that getting old forces on you, is that the world is no longer the world that you grew up in. This is inevitable. You are now an alien, and there are things you don't understand and can't understand and won't understand, even if you are in touch with young people, because they have it in their bones and you don't, and that's just reality. And I think it's important to bring humility to that situation, not to surrender judgment, but to recognize that you should go in with an open mind, ready to learn about what's going on. I would also say that one of the really distressing and maybe for some people exciting things about this moment, when people talk about how everything is shifting, is that assumptions that we didn't even realize we had as assumptions, that we just thought were the way the world works. We have to be prepared for any and all of those things to disappear. Whether that's, liberalism, or at least a consensus that liberalism is a good thing. Our ideas about, America's role in the world, what America is, what young people, all of those things. So I think, I didn't watch that whole video. I watched,
I don't think you missed much, but
well, I sort of watched like the 30-second or 60-second reel. I mean, it looks ghastly, but it's a real expression of something. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah, well, it's
sort of
designed to look ghastly, and I guess in part it's designed to offend guys like you and I. Shall we say, liberal, progressive, older people, or people who imagined ourselves once as progressives. You wrote an excellent book, as I said, Excellent Sheep, about the growing orthodoxy in American universities. And you haven't done much empirical research, I know, on young people recently. But the latest headlines about young people is that they voted Trump in a big way, according to NPR. And if NPR say a big way, then it must be a big way. Is it possible that we and you and I'm generalizing about you and I as this old progressive elite, that we simply don't understand young people these days? We're like our parents' generation of the 60s, when we went out and burnt our bras and burnt the flag. Not that you or I probably literally burnt our bras.
Again, I think we have to be open to that possibility, but also, and I think it's really important to say this whenever we talk about young people, Young people are not a monolith. Okay, I was just listening, as I do every day, to the Brian Lehrer Show, which is the last NPR program, public radio
Yeah, I've
program
been
I
on
used to
that.
listen
It's
to.
good.
Yeah, he's pretty good, but half the reason I listen to it is to kind of keep my uh, finger on the pulse of the continued progressive consensus. So there was the segment today was about how young Democrats are angry at Chuck Schumer, for supposedly capitulating on the government shutdown, budget resolution, whatever. But the young people they were talking about were the young progressive base, the high engagement activist voters of the Democratic Party. Those people exist, but they're just a slice, and I would say a small slice of their generation. Just like pre-Elon Musk Twitter, which Democrats took as sort of the voice of the people, was not by any means the voice of the people. Okay, so there are those young people, which are really the young people that I knew when I taught at Yale, and the ones I'm writing about in Excellent Sheep. They're those people, and they still exist. And I think they'd be very recognizable to us. I think we understand the distance that they've traveled, but they're still, progressive elites like you and I. The question is what's going on with the rest of the generation? And again, I don't think they're a monolith either. One of the striking facts is how large a gender gap there was in the election between young men and young women, right? Ezra Klein's, as we were talking about this, his most recent episode was with, what's the guy's name, the Democratic pollster? Shore, I think, Mark Shore, something like that. And
Yeah, I haven't read it. I haven't listened to it yet, but
yeah,
I
yeah,
plan to.
yeah. One of his charts shows the gender gap by age, and it's only about 10% above 30, but below 30, it's huge, and it's larger the younger you get. Okay, so then we, at very least, we have to acknowledge the difference between young women and young men. So who are we really talking about here? I think we're talking about young men. You said that video is undoubtedly designed in part to offend people like us, but it must also have been designed in part to appeal to maybe the young men that Trump has been winning over. And I think this is what we should talk about. I think it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, and I agree, and I wonder, in all seriousness, whether there is a new paranoia about young men. We had Richard Reeves on the show. I've known Richard for years. In fact, we shared the same literary agent. His book, Of Boys and Men, it really struggled to get published. It got turned down by hundreds of publishers. The only way they got it published was that Brookings published it, and then it turned into this sensation. Now he's started his own institute, the American Institute for Boys and Men, where all the old elites are now on the advisory council, people like Jason Furman, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Jonathan Haidt. Yeah. And I wonder whether this obsession with young men, whether the interesting thing is young men or the obsession with young men that people like Reeves and Haidt now are, I would say, almost guilty of.
No, I don't agree with you. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I think that it's a perfectly reasonable thing to obsess about. I mean, first of all, they're good political, if you are on the left half of the spectrum, they're damn good political reasons, because what we're seeing is that we're getting killed with young men. And, voting habits tend to get formed early in life, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if we want to be competitive, we have to understand what's going on with them. And also, I mean, look.
We being the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But also, I mean, we've spent a lot of time obsessing about young women, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. I think we should be concerned about whether they're thriving or not and what we can do to help them thrive. Well, men are half the world. One of the things that I've, let's say at the very least, been very disappointed with feminism, especially recent feminism, is that it's very casually callous about men and about young men. And, screw them, and men have had it all their own way for millennia, which is true. But I think we that's a very perilous attitude. And Reeves and people like him are right. It is still true that if you look at the Fortune 500 CEOs, they're mostly men. People in Congress, mostly men. Okay, well, you add the Fortune 500 CEOs in Congress, and that's like 1,000 people. And we're a country of 340 million people. So people probably already know these statistics. 70% of high school valedictorians are young women. Almost 60% of college graduates are women. More than 60% of people who get master's degrees are women. We can rehearse all the things that your listeners probably already know, the changes in economic structure, what happened to the old good jobs you could do without going to college, union jobs, blue collar jobs.
And this is all pre-AI revolution. These things are only going to get radically compounded in AI.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with AI, and what they've been telling us about AI is especially that it's going to come for white collar jobs. But maybe what you're saying is true too. Regardless of what happens with AI, yeah, I mean, it's an economy that's really tough for any young man who isn't one of my excellent sheep, who isn't a high achiever who goes to a fancy college, and that's the vast majority of young men.
Well, you wrote Excellent Sheep. You also wrote a piece for Tablet in June 2023 called Unfuckable Hate Nerds, which you suggest that we shouldn't hate these people. Tell us about these hate nerds, these unfuckable hate nerds. I don't quite know what the title means, but why should we be sympathetic to these people?
Right. So, I mean, it's Mark Maron, the podcaster. It's his term. And I think what he's saying is, like the incels. I think what he's talking of, they're repulsive, and and they have nothing going for them. They're introverts. They live in their mother's basement, but they take out all of their disappointments in life by being hateful and misogynistic online. And I recognize that that's a true phenomenon, and there's no excuse for the hate that they put out online. But I'm trying to get people to be a little more sensitive about where they might come from. And I talk about the fact that I'm not saying that I was an unfuckable hate nerd, but I would say that I was maybe 2 lucky breaks away from being one. I mean, I remember being a young man, and I was accumulating Ivy League degrees, and I had, girlfriends, and I wasn't in a terrible situation. And I still felt that what it is to be a young man is very often to be socially worthless. Socially worthless. I mean, the cliche is that women are sex objects and men are success objects. So, older women tend to be disregarded in a lot of contexts, and feminists are right to point this out and be pissed about it. Well, in analogous ways, young men share that fate. Like, you can really be invisible and disregarded. And yeah, this breeds a lot of resentment. And if on top of that, and I grew up in like the 70s and 80s. So then on top of that, we add the disappearance of good blue collar jobs, the gamification of dating through the apps, which creates a parallel distribution where like only the top 10% of men, the chads, are getting all the attention. When we add what I alluded to earlier, which is the really, I mean, quite frankly, hateful rhetoric that's been coming out of the left about men for a long time. I think it was Van Jones who said, with respect to men, like, if you tell people that they're not welcome in your party, they're going to leave. Like, what feminists...
I have to admit, I haven't noticed it as much as you. Where is this, or where has this hateful rhetoric come from towards men on the left?
Well, toxic. You've heard of the phrase toxic masculinity, which often seems to be used as an oxymoron, as a redundancy. Masculinity is ipso facto toxic, and the only models of masculinity that are held up as acceptable are basically femininity. Men should act like women. I think the phrase "dead white men." I mean, I understand it's about white and about dead, but I think it expresses a kind of hatred of men. I mean, Megan Daum talks about, she hated this sort of early 21st century feminism, women drinking from mugs that say, "I drink male tears." Or, I mean, it's a joke, but it's not funny. The future is female. The best man for a job is a woman. I mean, people hear this stuff Just like they hear Hillary Clinton saying deplorable, in the middle of the country, men hear this kind of language.
I know you're not a MAGA person, Bill, but you've been very critical in your career of the traditional university. You're a refugee. You did teach at Yale. An excellent sheep is built on that. Mm-hmm. Do you have any satisfaction now with MAGA revenge on the universities over some of this stuff? Apparently, the White House plans to, quote unquote, according to the Times, pause $175 million to Penn over transgender policy, and Columbia is getting fined $400 million unless it closes certain departments. Is this what universities then deserve, given what you're talking about?
No, I don't. I think it's horrible what they're doing. I mean, first of all, I don't even know why they're allowed to do it, and I hope that I would like to see it challenged in court. It sounds like Columbia is just going to capitulate. I mean, the idea that the president can just reach in and decide which, I mean, I don't understand why there's no due process here. I think it's terrifying. I think it's authoritarian. I think, the federal government has woven its way into every corner of society. I think appropriately. It funds, who doesn't take federal money on some level, which means he's now going to use his leverage by fiat to threaten and coerce. I think it's awful. It is not my prescription for making the university better. I don't even want to say that they've brought this on themselves because I mean, this is well beyond anything that should be happening, but it is true that universities, it's not just that so many of their policies, I think, have been stupid and wrong-headed, like DEI, like the obvious restrictions on free speech at least until October 7th. And I say this as someone who got to graduate school in 1989 and was on the inside for about 20 years. There was this sense of impunity or immunity. Like, it never occurred to them, whether we're talking about professors or administrators or whatever, that they can't just do whatever they want, that society will continue to write them a blank check, not just the federal government, but parents and foundations and everything. It's like they were, getting one over on everybody, and they thought, again, that nobody would ever notice. So, when humanities and social science departments sort of turn en masse to a relentless attack on, I don't know, the West, capitalism, America, the nuclear family, it turns out that they can't get away with that forever.
So there is, I'm not saying you're saying it's justified, but there is an element of at least amusement. You wrote a piece about your
not even amusement or Schadenfreude. This goes well beyond that.
Well, but you say
I just want to be clear about that.
Right. Okay, but the politics of the academy has been defeated.
Yeah, right.
So what does that mean, Bill?
Right. So I was actually asked, this appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which for those who don't know is basically, the house organ of American academia. It gets delivered to every faculty lounge. And they actually asked me to write a post-election piece. And they kind of pitched it to me as, have the politics of the academy been defeated? So, as I say in the very first paragraph, what do I mean by the politics of the academy? Obviously, not every academic has the same politics. Most of them are to the left of the center. But even then, there's great disagreement. But many, many academics have embraced a far left progressive ideology that everybody knows what it is. People call it wokeness, whatever you want to call it. But more than that, so have the institutions. I mean, this is October 7th was a watershed. But before October 7th, for at least maybe 10 or 15 years before that, we saw universities making statements and setting up offices and establishing programs. And they were all about this kind of post-liberal progressive ideology of hierarchies. And I mean, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with this. And I think the election was fought out on a lot of things, primarily economics and the border. But I go through, like in the second, third, and fourth paragraphs of that piece, I go through not mainly the presidential election, but all kinds of smaller elections, especially out here where we live on the West Coast, attorney general races, referenda, especially in California, referenda about affirmative action, recall elections for progressive prosecutors, the mayoral election in New York City that brought us Eric Adams, even though everybody already understood that there were a lot of problems with this guy, which was 2021. We have seen voters, and I specifically picked the West Coast and New York and a couple of other places because these are deep blue places. And even in these deep blue places, this politics, the politics that not only is shared by the academy, but really in many ways emanates from the academy, has been rejected. It's been rejected. And one of the big fights in the Democratic Party now is what to do with that. Yeah.
So you did an interesting interview with Daniel Oppenheimer, who also runs a good Substack, and actually I'm having him on my show. He wrote interesting piece on marriage therapy for the New York Times. The rise of the not left. What does this mean? Are you part, Bill, of the not left?
Right. Okay. So the timing is unfortunate because this is based on a piece that hasn't come out yet. And it's going to come out in Salmagundi, which is a very small literary journal, probably around the end of April.
Yeah, maybe we'll do another show later this year.
It would be great if we could do that because I want people to be able to look at it. Salmagundi, Robert Boyers, who's a wonderful guy who started the journal 61 years ago when he was 23 and is still running it. He also asked me to write a post-election reflection. And I had been thinking about something that I've been thinking about it because other people had already been talking about it, which is this sense that there's a lot of creative ferment on the right. I mean, I find it all either, at the very least silly and often abhorrent, but there's all kinds of stuff going on, trad wives and neo-pagans and, kind of almost sort of socialist conservative policy intellectuals, who are talking about the working class and can sometimes sound like Bernie Sanders, et cetera, all kinds of things going on. Whereas on the left, and I mean the whole left half of the spectrum, I've felt for actually a long time now, I wouldn't even say years, maybe decades, that it's just been intellectually stagnant.
Rather than stagnant, I would say frozen. Perhaps because of what you're suggesting, a degree of intolerance where people were nervous to actually say what they think. Maybe an unwillingness to write down what they think, or if they did write it down, being dismissed as neoconservative.
I think there's certainly that, right? But I would say that's again, the last 10 or 12 years. I think even before that, look, I'm not sure that I'm even competent. I'm not a political scientist. And I don't
Well, you're as competent as anybody else. Political scientists are part of the problem of turning this into social science.
Well, what I say in the piece is, I just watched the Dylan movie. I imagine a lot of people are listening to this, watch the Dylan movie. And
yeah, we trashed that one. I bet you hated it. Did you?
I thought it was fine. That's not why I bring it up. I mean, it's a Hollywood movie. It's a Hollywood movie. It was fine. It was entertaining to me. But the reason I mention it in the piece and mention it now is that it gives you a picture of the energy that on the left that was happening in the early 60s. It was a time of tremendous freedom and creativity, and also the seedbed of everything that came after, right? So it's the early civil rights movement. It's the early youth revolution. We're going to get feminism by the end of the decade, and we're going to get the gay rights movement by the end of the decade, et cetera, et cetera. My point is that it seems like everything since then has just been a playing out of the logic and a dwindling of the energies that originated in that kind of Big Bang moment in the 60s. And I think it was exhausted even by the 90s, if not earlier.
It's
Um,
interesting. In
yeah,
terms of that movie, one of the criticisms I read, probably in the New York Times or one of these papers, was that I mean, there's only one New York Times, of course, that the movie reflected the problem with Dylan is he wasn't political enough, because one of the messages in the movie was that there was a left, but Dylan saw himself as an artist and never was particularly interested in the politics of his day.
yeah, I think that was actually in Barry Weiss. I think that was in the Free Press, and I thought that was really interesting. That what he was really rejecting and rejecting the folkies was this kind of demand that he be political, and that he never was. But I mean, that may be true, but there were tremendous political energies that were certainly associated with his music, whether he liked it or not, but also much, much more broadly in the culture. And I was born in '64, grew up in the '70s, so this excitement, this creative excitement, and this sense of political hope, or even more than hope, political triumphalism. And that's all just turned to shit for a long time. And I think one of the reasons is that there was that initial impetus that's just been getting weaker and weaker and weaker. I mean, already by '92 with Clinton, the Democrats were pivoting away from progressivism. And I kind of feel like they've been stuck in that ever since, right? Like, a lot of people aren't happy. I'm not very happy with sort of center-left, neoliberal Clintonianism. But what alternative has there been? The progressive left has either just seemed exhausted, or more recently has become this post-liberal, woke, extremely censorious, as you said, form of the left that also doesn't seem to have any hope to it. Because, listen, I think there's no hope and there's no energy if you're suppressing all creativity, all debate, all dissent. This is another thing that we see on the right now. People are arguing with each other. People are happy to argue with each other. They're happy to, entertain ideas. Even, again, I mean, some of these ideas are crazy and malevolent, but they just seem like they're having fun over there. And I think,
why don't you join them?
Well, because I hate everything they stand for. But I look around and I think, why can't we have that? And if we did have that, I think we might be able to move forward. There's been this sense, postmodernism, right? There's been this sense that the culture has been kind of just running in circles for a very long time. But maybe what's really been running in circles is the left half the culture, which has been dominating the culture.
Yeah, you noted you're not a political scientist. You're a cultural historian, a cultural critic. And you wrote another interesting piece. You're prolific, Bill, in Persuasion, another interesting publication. We feature a lot of their writing about how art has lost its way. What's the connection? You've always been somewhat pessimistic as a cultural critic, like most cultural critics, but is there a connection between the fact, in your view at least, that art has lost its way with the fact that the left has lost its way? Because, of course, the great artists of the 20th century mostly were on the left. From, some of them weren't very nice people, like Picasso or others, but they were mostly on the left.
Well, I mean, a lot of them weren't, right? I mean, Yeats and Pound, and there were plenty of fascists over there. I don't really, I mean, that's not a piece about politics. And so you're asking me to think out loud, which I'm happy to do. First of all, I don't think that artists should have a politics that enters their art. I mean, this is one of the things that the left has done to the arts recently. They also did it in the '30s, where art has to toe the political line. And that's just death to art, because you have to have the freedom to go where you go. And you also have the freedom the freedom to not be political. I mean, I think that that's essential. But what I really talk about in that piece, and maybe we can figure out ways that this is connected, is that I think people just don't take art as seriously as they used to. Like for a long time, and I think this is what modern art was about, art was a matter of life or death, metaphorically, but still, like your life depended on it. Like having a good life depended on challenging yourself with challenging works of art that was going to kind of ratchet you up to a higher level of consciousness. And this was understood if you were, for instance, a college student, not every college student, but many college students felt that it was incumbent on them, to go to art house movies and read challenging novels and read poetry and, take courses in philosophy. That this was sort of an essential part of what it meant to be responsible to yourself as a person, right? This is part of the project of being alive. I mean, I think as a public phenomenon, that's completely gone, and it's been completely gone for a long time. And I think then the internet just completely made it far worse, because now art has become content, and content is just perfectly disposable, right? So, I mean, a Dylan album would come out and the world would come to a standstill. Everyone ran out and bought the LP and listened to it and absorbed it. And now you turn on Spotify or whatever, and it's like turning on the tap. It's just an endless stream of undifferentiated stuff that just goes in one ear and out the other. That's what I'm talking about. Now, when artists are dealing with that kind of audience, they can't be serious either. If they don't have people to respond to what they're doing, you either sort of bend the knee to Spotify or Netflix or whatever your medium is, or commercial fiction, or you continue to follow the hard and stony path of true art, but in obscurity.
But the avant-garde was always uncompromising. There still are avant-gardes, aren't there, in art, in poetry, in music?
Well, that's what I was referring to when I said, following the stony path in obscurity. But I think there's a big difference. The modern, even mid-20th century avant-garde ultimately had a tremendous impact on the way the rest of us see the world. When, you mentioned Picasso, right? So when Picasso finally enters the mainstream, it's the mainstream that has to come closer to Picasso. And now it seems to me that it's the opposite, that if you want to enter the mainstream as an artist, you have to do it on the terms of the mainstream. I mean, a lot of this, again, also just has to do with the economics and the dynamics of the internet.
Which means putting up an Instagram page.
There you go.
David Lynch died a couple of weeks ago. I think he's another good model for your argument.
Absolutely. I mean, he's a great example. David Lynch found it impossible later in his career to get his movies budgeted, which is why he didn't really make any movies in this last few. I mean, there was that moment where television was good, and he was able to make the third season of Twin Peaks, but that's gone now too.
So all this comes to another of your great questions, Bill. You're a font of wisdom. Who are the new elite? Another piece that you've authored on who actually holds power these days, and I think it may be the key question of the age, and maybe the way forward for progressives to rethink the value of elites. So who are the real elites, and how should progressives think of elites?
I wrote that piece. It was just a little occasional piece that Daniel Oppenheimer, who you're going to have on soon, asked me to write, because he's at UT Austin, and he was organizing a panel for a conference they had a couple
which
of
is
weeks
very
ago.
different from the University of Austin.
Yes, very different from the University of Austin. This is the University of Texas at Austin. So we had a little panel on who are the real elite. Michael Lind, who I think is great, was on the panel, and Kristen
who's
Silverstein.
another of the naughty boys who's been censored and still survives.
Yeah,
and was accused of all sorts of sins, but actually was, I think, quite accurate in how he saw the future.
Yeah, he writes. I read him in Tablet, and I think he's brilliant. And Kristen Soltis Anderson, the pollster. So Daniel asked me to write a kind of an advanced piece, laying out my thoughts. It's not something I've thought about very much. Who are the real elite? So I start by reflecting on the fact that it's interesting that we're asking the question at all. Like, why don't we know that? Was it always the case that we didn't know? I don't think it was always the case that we didn't know. Then there's also the question, I mean, I don't want to get too sort of disappearing up my asshole philosophical, but like, what exactly do we mean by the elite? In what ways is that term kind of loaded, and what does it tell us about the way we think about things, that what we put on it, including the fact that a lot of people, and maybe this is one of the pathologies of the progressive elite, don't want to think of themselves as elite. Like, we're in a democratic society, first of all, so theoretically we shouldn't have an elite. And then also, if you're a progressive, you're a radical egalitarian. So how could you possibly endorse the existence of an elite? Well, by the way, you're part of an elite. Don't kid yourself. You know that perfectly well. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I do think that one of the most interesting things about this moment is that it seems pretty clear that for the first time I'm aware of, certainly the first time I remember, we have a group we have a new elite in formation, the Trumpist Musk elite, that's trying to destroy the existing elite. I mean, it's a very common thing for, say, Jews who were excluded from the elite to demand entry. And 60s, 70s, admissions policies changed. Jews are allowed into the elite. Asians are allowed into the elite. Women are allowed into the elite. Good. This is sort of a normal thing. We are not talking about outsiders wanting entry into the existing elite. We are talking about people, whether they're outsiders or not. I mean, many of them are Silicon Valley billionaires who want to destroy the existing elite. I mean, that's what Trump's, you put those things up on the screen, what Trump is doing to Columbia, what Trump is doing to Penn. I mean, I think it's devastatingly short-sighted, but that's part of that push, right? To destroy.
It's ironic. A lot of people have written about the way in which Silicon Valley appropriated the counterculture. In your essay, you write about C. Wright Mills, the Power Elite, which was one of the books on elites and results you left, which many people now are very critical of, and SDS and all the rest of it. What's your take on its role and the way in which guys like Musk in particular and the Silicon Valley crowd have appropriated the counterculture for their own ends, and now these billionaires dress like homeless people? Lots of books have been written about this.
Yeah, I haven't thought about this very much. I mean, my first thought is that David Brooks was writing about this a long time ago. He wasn't writing about
Bobos, which is a good book. It's a great best book by far.
I think it's a great book, and I think he puts his finger on something that's still true, even though he wasn't talking about those exact people then. Which is, it's also what I alluded to, that progressive elites don't want to think of themselves as elite, because the cool thing to be is countercultural. So what Brooks describes is how the 60s insurgency became the establishment. That's who the Bobos are. They're right bourgeois bohemians. They are the old bohemians from the 60s who became the establishment, but still pretend that they're bohemians.
Right, and it's C. Wright Mills with his university job and his motorbike and his many girlfriends.
And many other examples.
I mean, the whole wrong, Bill, to have many girlfriends.
But the whole style, right? The whole style of success, of power, of eliteness became this countercultural style, and style is neither here nor there, except that style also means something, and it means it's a disavowal. We're not the people in the suits. But, well, okay, you're not the people in the suits, but that's just because you're not wearing suits. You are the people in the suits.
Yeah, and of course the rebellion was against the men in the gray suits.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a style, a C. Wright Mill countercultural style, in the same way as as Dan Brooks talked about, a MAGA style. I wonder, thinking again out loud, Bill, and you've been very generous with your time, so we have to wrap up in a second. What happened in the 60s was that C. Wright Mill presented the counterculture as dangerous, but it really ultimately wasn't. He might have died young, and the ethos of rock and roll was to die young, but these people became the culture. They became the conventional way of seeing the world, and they became the economic and cultural elites. The rebellion against them was by people who, for better or worse, took risks. So might one imagine that in the future, as the Trump reaction begins to shut university departments down, throw people out of the country, threaten them with all sorts of punishments if they say the wrong thing, that culture will acquire, if not a backbone, certainly that frisson of danger that will resurrect it?
It's very hard to say. It's very hard to predict. I also want to say a good word about the 60s counterculture. I mean, I think it's easy and in some ways justified to be skeptical of what it achieved and how it became a new establishment, but it did achieve some very important things. I mean, there really was a social revolution that had lasting positive impact, I think, in all kinds of ways. You know, the rights revolutions are, you know, most obviously. But you're asking a more complicated, a more difficult question. Where is culture going to go now? So we're talking about this right-wing counterculture, right? This sort of not left, ballerina farms and all that crap. That's really bringing new things into society. At the same time, it's taking power in Washington. So how long can it last as a counterculture before it becomes the establishment? And if and when it does, and there's a long way to go before it does, will it revive a genuine counterculture on the left? I don't know. I don't know. But again, I think no such revival can occur as long as the left continues to be as censorious as it has been. I mean, that's just the death to any kind of new possibility. We have to develop, we have to develop a new set of responses.
But I
don't know that that's possible, to be honest with you.
Why not?
Well, I mean, maybe this is too organicist, but I mean, I think.
To accuse, for example, to accuse Trump of being a sexist or a misogynist or this or that is obviously absurd. But this is the moment for satirists and ironists, real satirists and ironists, isn't it? To take risks in form, in novels.
Oh, sure. The question is,
the beauty of the internet is anyone can put anything up. Anyone can make a movie, put it up on YouTube. Anyone can even self-publish a book or put their music up online.
Yes.
So why
you're
wouldn't
right.
this happen?
You're right. No, I mean, actually, this is the moment where I say, look at Substack. Substack is a wonderful thing. Most of my stuff is published on there now.
But though it's full of guys like you and I, we may not be.
Well, it's full of all kinds of things. I mean, this is what Daniel Oppenheimer and I were talking about in his, Eminent Americans podcast. You can check that out. All the people like Daniel Oppenheimer, and we mentioned a whole bunch of other people. A lot of the people that he's had on his podcast. Blake Smith, Sam Kahn, Justin Smith Ruyu. I mean, there are all kinds of really interesting people writing on Substack now. And that's the point, is that all kinds of different interesting things are happening now, which is not the case in the legacy, mainstream, established, elite liberal organs like the New York Times.
So in other words, things aren't quite as miserable as you've sometimes...
Things may not be quite... There may be some green shoots there.
Well, Bill, and I'm going to say your last name again, Bill.
Deresiewicz.
Deresiewicz. I always want to say Deresiewicz, but it's Deresiewicz, who is my go-to guy when it comes to cultural forces. author of The End of Solitude, wonderful collection of his most recent essays, and also the author, of course, of Excellent Sheep. I know you're working on an interesting autobiography, Bill, that will be out in the not too distant future. Keep well, keep thinking, keep causing trouble. And I guarantee you next time, or I try to guarantee you next time, I'll be able to pronounce your last name.